chained, dragged through the dust, and the drifter watching from the shadow of the livery stable would cost that Marshal everything. He was the name those men feared most in the territory, and not a single soul on that street knew it. Before I tell you how it happened, let me set the scene right. This is late summer of 1882 in the New Mexico Territory, in a town called Caldwell Creek, a place where the law was whatever the man wearing the badge said it was, and where a young widow asking the wrong questions could find herself answering to iron chains in the middle of the street. Her name was Grace Hollis. She was 27 years old, dark-haired, with a set to her jaw that said she'd been through hard things before and hadn't been made smaller by any of them. Her husband had died 14 months prior, a fever that came on fast in early spring and didn't give him time to fight it, and she'd kept their small homestead running north of town on stubbornness and not much else. That was who they had in those chains, not a criminal. A widow, a woman who'd asked where the young women went. If you've ever seen wrong dressed up as law, then you know exactly what this story is about. Subscribe if the frontier speaks to you, and tell me, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Now let's go back to the beginning. The beginning for Grace Hollis started with a letter. Not a letter she received herself, a letter her younger sister Nora had received 2 months before Grace rode into Caldwell Creek. Nora was 19. She was the kind of young woman who smiled at strangers and believed in the good faith of official-looking stationery, and the letter that arrived at their homestead in late June had all the markings of legitimacy, a wax seal, a printed heading, a signature at the bottom that read, Marshal Thaddeus Crowne, Town of Caldwell Creek, New Mexico Territory. The letter offered Nora honest work at the freighting company's way station in town. Bookkeeping, it said, clean rooms, decent pay, protection and steady employment, which were the two things a young woman on the frontier wanted most and got least. Their mother had been ill for 3 months, and the homestead was behind on its accounts. Nora had looked at the letter and then at the numbers in the household ledger and then at her older sister. Grace had worried about it. But the letter looked real, and they needed the money, and Nora had a way of deciding things once the sense of it was clear to her. She'd packed a bag and gone. That was in early July. Letters had come back twice in the first 2 weeks, then once more in the third week, and then they stopped. Grace waited 2 more weeks before she started writing to the Marshal's office. The replies, when they came, were polite and useless. She wrote to the county seat. She wrote to the freighting company's main office 200 miles south, and got back a printed form letter informing her that no person named Nora Hollis was currently employed or had ever been employed with their company. She held that letter in her hand on the homestead porch for a long time. Then she packed her own bag and rode north. She spent her first week in Caldwell Creek doing what careful people do when they don't yet know the shape of what they're in. She watched and listened and asked questions that sounded like ordinary curiosity. She went to Sunday services at the Calvary Church, sat in the 3rd row, and paid attention to who sat where. She ate at the lunch counter and listened to what people talked about. She went to the dry goods store 3 times for things she didn't need much, and made small talk with the woman behind the counter. The picture she assembled was not a comfortable one. People in Caldwell Creek did not talk easily. There was a particular quality to the silence she got when certain subjects came near. The freighting company, the Marshal's office. The question of work offers for young women a silence that wasn't ignorance. It was the silence of people who knew something and had decided, each in their own private way, that knowing it was safer than talking about it. The woman at the boarding house, a hard-faced woman named Celestine who'd run it alone for 12 years, told Grace on her 3rd night to be careful about what she poked at. Just that. Be careful. Nothing more. The old freighter at the wagon yard, a leather-faced man named Augusto who worked out of a loading dock behind the main building, had told her a little more, and only after looking around to make sure nobody was watching. He wasn't the first family member to come to Caldwell Creek looking, he'd said. It hadn't ended well for any of them. Then he'd gone back to loading freight, and wouldn't look at her again. By the end of her second week, Grace had confirmed what she'd suspected from the moment she received the freighting company's denial. 4 young women, she could name 4, though she thought there might be more, had received letters from Marshal Crowne's office over the previous 18 months. Work offers, all of them, all from official-looking stationery, all signed by the same man. The women had gone to Caldwell Creek and never returned. Their families had come looking one by one, and the marshal had told each of them the same thing. The woman they were looking for had never arrived, had probably gotten scared off the road and turned back, was not the marshal's concern. None of the families had believed it. None of them had been able to do anything about it. Grace had gone to the marshal's office on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of August, and sat across the desk from Marshal Thaddeus Crowne and laid it out plainly. She wasn't dramatic about it. She wasn't accusatory, exactly. She just told him what she'd found. The pattern, the letters, the families, the denials, and asked him to explain it to her. Crowne was a handsome man in the theatrical way of men who have learned that their appearance is useful. Strong jaw, silver at his temples, a posture that filled a room without needing to move. He wore his silver badge the way an actor wears a costume, consciously, with awareness of the effect it had on people who looked at it. He listened to Grace with the particular patience of a man who isn't worried because he has no reason to be worried. And when she was done, he told her with perfect courtesy that her sister had never been in Caldwell Creek, that the letter she was describing sounded like a forgery, that he'd look into it personally, that she should go home and let the matter rest. Grace told him she intended to do no such thing. 3 days after that conversation, Deputy Harker and Deputy Voss arrived at Celestine's boarding house at midday. Celestine would tell the story later how the deputies had come in without knocking, how they'd found Grace in the dining room, how they'd put iron cuffs on her wrists with a horsehair rope run through them and told her she was under arrest for stealing a horse from the freighting company's yard. Grace hadn't argued. She'd looked at the chain connecting her wrists, and then up at Celestine, and the look she gave said, "Remember this, because I'm going to need it remembered." They walked her out the front door of the boarding house and south down Caldwell Creek's main street, slow enough that everyone could see. This was not about a stolen horse. Marshal Crowne had appeared on the jailhouse steps ahead of them, arms folded, badge in the sun. He watched her come from a block away and didn't hurry. This was the message. This was what Crowne was saying to every woman in the territory who might think about looking too hard at where other women went. Here is what happens to you. Here are the chains. Here is the street. Here is the town watching and not helping. Every person on that street saw it. The barber stood in his doorway. The woman from the dry goods store had come out to her step. 3 men on the bench in front of the saloon had gone still. Old men, young women, children behind their mothers' legs. The whole main street of Caldwell Creek was out in the August heat and watching, and every single one of them looked somewhere that wasn't Grace Hollis. Every one of them but a man standing in the shadow of the livery stable near the north end of the street. His name was Cole Devereaux, and he hadn't used it much lately. He went by whatever the nearest person called him, drifter, mister, sometimes nothing at all. He was 39 years old, built lean the way a man goes lean when he eats irregularly and moves often, with hands that were large and a face that showed his years in ways that had nothing to do with softness. His coat was the color of dry creek bed, and his hat was pulled so its brim put his eyes in shadow, which was how he liked it. He'd arrived in Caldwell Creek the night before with a horse that needed rest and a saddlebag that needed provisioning, and he planned to be gone before noon. He was not gone before noon. He stood in that shadow and watched the chain drag in the dust between Grace Hollis's boots, and he watched her try to keep her footing on the loose packed dirt of the street. And he watched the 2 deputies walk her like something they'd roped and were taking to a pen, and something shifted in him that he hadn't felt shift in a long time. He knew what the shift meant. It meant he wasn't leaving on his original schedule. Cole Devereaux had been a U.S. deputy marshal out of the Santa Fe office for 7 years, from 1872 to 1879. In that time, he had arrested 41 men, transported 18 prisoners, and been in 6 gunfights, of which he had walked away from 6. He'd been considered within the marshal's service a careful, thorough, and reliable officer, someone the senior marshal sent when precision mattered more than speed. He'd earned commendations twice. He'd believed, for most of those 7 years, that the law and the right thing were the same thing, and that serving one was the same as serving the other. He'd learned they weren't in the spring of 1879 in a courthouse in Albuquerque, on a Tuesday afternoon that he could still describe in exact detail 4 years later, the quality of the light, the way the air smelled of cigar smoke and sawdust, the sound of the judge's voice saying, "Remanded for execution." The woman's name was Ruth Cassidy. She had been convicted on testimony that Cole, working her case later on his own time, had found was bought and delivered by the man she'd originally testified against, a mining company owner with 4 judges in his pocket, and money enough to stay comfortable in that pocket indefinitely. Cole had arrested Ruth Cassidy on a valid warrant, because the warrant was legal, because the system said bring her in, and he'd believed the system. The system had hanged her. Cole had stood outside that courthouse for a long time with his badge in his hand. Then he'd walked to the river and put the badge in the current and watched it go. He'd been walking since, roughly north to south and back again across the territory, picking up work where it existed, cattle drives, freight runs, fence repair, night watching, going somewhere in the same way water goes somewhere when it runs downhill, following the grade without much choosing. Seeing Grace in that chain had picked the old wound like a finger pressed against a bruise. He let the procession pass him. He was a man who thought before he acted. It was the quality that had made him useful as a deputy, and it was the quality that had saved his life in 6 gunfights. He needed to know what he was inside before he did anything, so he waited and watched and spent the afternoon learning. Around mid-afternoon, Deputy Harker found him. Cole was at the water trough at the south end of the livery, seeing to his horse, when Harker came up and leaned against the fence rail with the easy posture of a man who wasn't in any hurry. He was a thick man, not tall, with a lawman's habit of keeping his gun hand low and visible. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at Cole the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he's considering moving. Then, passing through, Cole said he was. Harker nodded. He looked at the horse, looked at Cole's coat, at the saddlebags on the fence rail, the kind of look that was an inventory. Road south opens up right around dawn, Harker said. Good traveling in the early cool. A man with fresh grain and a rested horse wouldn't have much reason to linger past that. Cole kept working the brush along his horse's flank. He said he'd keep that in mind. Harker didn't move for another moment. Then he straightened off the rail and walked away south toward the jailhouse without looking back, his boots raising small puffs of dust on the dry street. Cole watched him go. He'd been told to leave towns before, and he understood what it meant when someone took the trouble to tell him politely. It meant they were not entirely sure of him. It meant the polite version was the first version, and the other versions were scheduled. He finished with the horse and went to find Augusto. He learned from Augusto, the old freighter, who was willing to talk to him behind the loading dock in the wagon yard when he saw Cole's face and hands, and the patient way Cole stood and listened. Augusto had been holding what he knew at a pressure that was becoming difficult to manage. He'd known about Crowne's operation for nearly a year. He knew because his own niece, Celestine's daughter's closest friend, had been one of the women. He hadn't talked because he had an aging sister who ran the boarding house and 2 grandsons under 7 years old, and Crowne had people enough in this town to make his meaning clear to anyone who got inconvenient. What Augusto knew was this: Crowne had been running his arrangement for close to 2 years. Young women from surrounding counties, women who were either alone or in difficult enough circumstances to be tempted by a good offer on official paper. Letters from the Marshal's office. They arrived and then they didn't leave. The Marshal had the town's cooperation in layers. Some people knew and were paid. Some knew and were frightened. Some suspected and had convinced themselves not to know. The town's preacher, a man named Horton, who ran the Calvary Church, kept the books. Not a man of violence himself, but a meticulous record-keeper with a ledger that documented everything: names, dates, amounts, destinations. Augusto had heard about the ledger from 2 different sources. He thought it was in the church somewhere. Cole thanked him. He sat with the information for an hour, thinking. The hour felt long. He sat on a crate behind the loading dock with the evening light going flat and orange over the rooftops to the west, and he worked it through the way he'd been trained to work things through, not the feeling first, but the shape. Who knew what? What the evidence actually was versus what could be demonstrated. What a territorial marshal would need to move on a sitting lawman who had the county's cooperation. The feeling came anyway, the way it always did when the shape was clear enough. He'd been in the territory long enough to know that what Crowne had built was not a thing built by one man alone. It needed help. From the deputy who told drifters to take the South Road at dawn. From the preacher who kept ledgers in a locked room. From the townspeople who'd filed that information under what I don't need to know and got on with their days. The chain that had dragged in the dust of that street wasn't made of iron alone. It was made of all those small decisions, stacked up into a weight. He thought about Harker at the water trough. The way the man had done the math on him and come up with, probably not a problem. He'd been wrong about that. Most people who underestimated Cole Devereaux did so for the same reason. He didn't perform. He didn't puff himself up or carry himself like a man with a reputation. He just stood there and watched things. And by the time someone understood what they were looking at, he was usually already inside the problem. He got up and dusted off his coat when the light went below the rooftops. Then after supper, when the 2 deputies had taken themselves to the saloon, he went to the jail. The jail was an adobe building with a cell that held 1 person in reasonable comfort, and a lock that Cole had seen the same model of before. He'd carried the matching key at his belt for 3 years, once upon a time. He worked a lock with 2 flat pieces of metal from his coat pocket. 43 seconds, which was close enough to his personal record, and went inside. Grace Hollis was sitting on the plank bench, with her wrists still pink from the chains. She stood up fast when the door moved, and the way she stood told him she'd been sitting there with a plan already forming. Not waiting for rescue, but waiting for an opportunity. Whatever was coming through that door, she'd been going to use. Cole looked at her in the lamp's low light and kept his voice quiet. Grace Hollis, I'm not one of Crowne's men, but we need to move. She studied him for 3 seconds with the lamp behind him and most of his face in shadow. Whatever she decided, it happened fast. He got her north to the line shack Augusto had mentioned, half a mile out, sitting empty. And she ate and drank what he had in his kit without rushing it, because she hadn't had food or water in 6 hours. When she was done, he laid out what he knew, and she added to it, and the picture they assembled between them, sitting across a small table with a stub candle and the night around the shack going quiet, was more complete and more serious than either of them had known alone. Grace had confirmed in her 2 weeks in Caldwell Creek that at least 6 young women had gone in response to Crowne's letters in the last 18 months. She'd found a date ledger in the records of the boarding house that showed when women had arrived in town and then stopped appearing at meals. 3 days, 4 days, a week after arrival, they just weren't there anymore. She knew who some of the buyers were because one old woman at the far end of town, who was either half blind enough to speak freely or wise enough to know the situation was past saving through silence, had given her a name. A cattle baron 3 counties east who'd been doing business with Crowne for over a year. And she knew one other thing, which she'd put together herself from a week of watching Horton move around his church, the false wall staircase behind the vestry. She'd noticed the way he never let anyone near a certain closet at the back of the church building. The way he'd glanced at it during her second Sunday service, the way a man glances at the thing he's most worried about, the way the lock on the vestry door was newer and heavier than everything else in a building that had been standing since 1864. She'd suspected a cellar. She hadn't been sure what was in it. Now she was. Nora's name, her sister's name, was almost certainly in Horton's ledger. Cole listened to all of this, and then he sat quiet for a while with the sound of the desert around the shack and the dying fire between them. He'd seen a lot of bad things in his time as a deputy. He'd carried warrants for men who'd done things that made you want to put the paper down and wash your hands. But there was something about the orderliness of what Crowne had built. The official stationery, the wax seals, the preacher's careful bookkeeping, that bothered him in a particular way. It was the banality of it, the filing, the system of it, like a business. He gave Grace his extra blanket and told her to sleep. She looked at him like she was considering arguing. "I need a partner who can stand up straight tomorrow," Cole said. "Rest." She lay down and her eyes closed. He sat with his back against the wall and the Colt across his knee and thought through the plan until the sky started to gray. By sunrise, he had 3 things he needed to do, in order. First, find an ally inside Caldwell Creek, someone with reach enough to get a message to a real lawman outside Crowne's territory. Second, get the ledger from Horton's church, because without it the women's testimony was everything, and Crowne's lawyers would spend the year discrediting each one. Third, and this one was the constraint that made everything else harder, get the women out of that cellar before the confrontation with Crowne, because if the women were still underground when the shooting started, Crowne would use them as his exit. He'd done that calculation, so had Cole. And here's a good moment to check in with you, partner. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? If you've got something in your cup, lift it. Because this story's got a long way to go yet, and every mile of it matters. If you haven't subscribed, go ahead and do that now, because we put out these frontier stories regular, and this one's getting into the teeth of it. Back to Caldwell Creek. The ally was Celestine. He found her at the boarding house an hour after first light, coming out the back door with a bucket, and he introduced himself with no preamble and told her exactly what he and Grace had put together and what he planned to do about it. Celestine set the bucket down and listened without interrupting. She was 56 years old, and she had the particular stillness of a woman who had been holding something heavy for a long time and had learned not to show the weight. When Cole was done, she was quiet for a moment. Celestine's first words were a question with no question in her voice. "She's alive." "You're sure of that?" Cole laid out what Augusto had told him, the ledger, the current entries, the way those entries were maintained like accounts receivable in a shipping ledger. He couldn't promise the word was still accurate. He thought it was. He told her why. Celestine put her face in her hands. Just for a moment, then she raised it again, and her eyes were dry and her expression was the expression of a woman who had been ready for a conversation like this one for 2 years and was done waiting. She had a son, a young man named Ramon, who ran freight on the southern road and knew it well enough to ride it in the dark. He could be in Mesilla by nightfall if he left in the next hour. She wouldn't trust the Caldwell Creek telegraph. Crowne had a man there, had put him there 2 years ago, a fact she'd known and had told herself was not her business. That telling had cost her. Mesilla's telegraph was clean, and from Mesilla a message could reach the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe inside an hour. She sent the boy within 20 minutes. Cole had watched the horse go south on the freight road until it was a speck in the morning haze. The ledger took more care. Cole spent most of that day moving around Caldwell Creek, the way drifters move, slow, purposeful about nothing, stopping to look at things with the relaxed attention of a man with nowhere to be. He bought grain for his horse at the feed store. He ate lunch at the counter near the stable. He sat on a fence rail outside the feedlot in the afternoon heat and watched the Calvary Church from 200 yards out, paying attention to who went in and out and when. The deputies, Harker on one side, Voss on the other, walked their rounds every 2 hours with enough regularity that you could set a watch by them. Horton came out twice during the day for brief errands, both times locking the church's main door behind him. He carried 2 keys on his belt. Cole had noticed that the first time he came out, a small key on a separate ring from the main door key, shorter and older looking. Storage room, almost certainly. The kind of key a man keeps because what it opens is something he opens often. The second time Horton came back, Cole noticed something else. The preacher glanced at the side of the church building as he went back in. A practice glance, automatic, the kind a man doesn't know he makes anymore. He was checking the side window, making sure it was still latched. Cole filed that. The side window, when Cole went back to it after dark, was not as latched as Horton thought. He was inside the church by 2 a.m, moving by feel through a space he'd walked in his mind 6 times during the daylight hours. The storage room was off the vestry, behind the closet, exactly as he'd expected. The lock was a double-lever model, the good kind. The kind that cost money, and it took him closer to 3 minutes than he'd have liked. But the church was quiet, and the town was quiet, and 3 minutes was 3 minutes. Inside the room, under a stack of hymnals that had not been opened recently judging by the dust on them, he found what he'd come for. The ledger was a standard accounting book, the kind any merchant or shipping clerk might keep. Inside it, Horton had maintained the operations records with the kind of care that came from believing the records would never see daylight. Dates and names on the left columns, payment amounts in the center, destinations and buyer names on the right. Nora Hollis's name was on page 31, entered 9 weeks prior, with a delivery date 3 days after her arrival and a destination written in a small, careful hand. She was listed as delivered. The entry after her name, written a week later, showed payment received. Below the payment entry, in red ink, a single word, current. That was the word Cole needed. Current meant not transferred. Current meant still at the destination address 2 counties east. Current meant still alive. He slid the ledger inside his coat and left the same way he'd come. Grace was awake when he got back to the line shack. She'd been awake for a while, he could tell. The fire was built up, and she was sitting at the table with her hands flat on the wood and the look of a woman who had been very still in the dark and thought things through. He laid the ledger open on the table in front of her and pointed to page 31. She put her hand flat over the page with Nora's name on it. The way a person presses a wound. He let her have that silence. She looked up from the page. The cellar next. He nodded. They went over the plan. The Calvary Church's vestry door opened from an alley on the building's west side, a narrow passage between the church and the lot next to it. Cole had walked it once in daylight and once in the first hour of dark, counting steps, noting the footing, noting the position of the door. Grace told him about the closet at the back of the vestry, the false panel she'd suspected, the section of the back wall that had a slightly different tone when she'd knocked it, once when Horton's attention was elsewhere. The pivot catch would be low, Cole thought, because it always was. Put the leverage at the bottom and you keep the seam tight at eye level. They went at 4 a.m. when the town was as dark and quiet as it ever got. Celestine met them in the alley with 2 extra lanterns, a blanket roll, and a short-barreled shotgun that she held like someone who had fired one before. She wasn't coming inside, she'd decided. She was staying at the alley's end to watch for Crowne's men, and if a deputy came around the corner before they were done, she would do what needed doing about that. Cole did not try to talk her out of it. Some decisions are arguments. The vestry door took 18 seconds. The false panel at the back of the closet swung open on its pivot when Cole pressed the lower right corner, and from behind it came stairs going down and the smell of a low, closed room. Earth and straw and the particular human smell of people confined in a space too small for them. He went down first, lantern turned low. The cellar ran the length of the church above it, maybe 40 feet, with earthen walls and a floor of packed dirt. Along the right wall were pallets, 8 of them, placed at intervals. On 6 of the pallets were sleeping women. The 7th and 8th pallets were empty, recently used. The straw was still shaped from the bodies that had lain there. Iron rings were set into the base of the wall at each pallet station, and from the rings ran short chain lengths that ended in ankle irons. 6 women, all of them sleeping, or near enough to it that they didn't stir when he came down. Cole stood still for a moment at the bottom of the stairs and just looked. The earthen walls, the chain rings, the pallets with their thin straw. He'd been in jails before, in his years as a deputy, and he'd seen holding cells that were rougher and held more people. But there was something about the church directly above his head, the plain wooden floor of the Calvary Church of Caldwell Creek, 2 feet of adobe over his head, Sunday services every week, the preacher walking that floor keeping the books of an operation like this. That made the back of his throat tighten in a way that was not anger exactly, but something with anger in it. He crouched by the nearest woman, 20 or so, blonde hair damp at the temples, even in the cool of the underground room, and put his hand on her shoulder with the kind of care that doesn't startle. She came awake in stages, the way people wake when they've been sleeping deep and don't want to. Her eyes found him in the lantern light and went wide. He put a finger to his lips and then pointed up. The ceiling, the street above, the sound of anyone passing. Then he held up the pick he'd brought for the locks and pointed to the chain at her ankle. Her face did something complicated. Then she lay still and let him work the lock. Grace had come down behind him and moved to the other pallets, touching shoulders, kneeling by faces in the dark, bringing women up from sleep into confused, quiet waking. One of them started to make a sound, and Grace's hand covered her mouth gently, and she shook her head, and the woman, perhaps 18, too young for this room, closed her eyes and held the sound inside herself. The ankle locks were the same model on every pallet station. Cole worked them one by one as fast as he could in the low light. The women sat up and rubbed their ankles where the iron had been, some of them helping each other without being asked. None of them spoke. There was a quality to the silence they kept that told Cole they'd had hard practice at it. At the third pallet, a young woman, brown hair, maybe 22, with a stillness in her face that didn't look like calm, but like something that had used up all its panic a while back, caught his wrist while he was working the lock. Her fingers were thin and strong. She looked up at him in the lantern's low light, and her mouth moved without sound, forming a question. How many of us? He held up 6 fingers. The same number in the room. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she let go of his wrist and let him finish the lock. He moved to the next pallet and heard very quietly the sound of her exhaling, slow, controlled, a breath that had been held in a long time. One of the women beside her reached over and took her hand, and they stayed like that, palm to palm in the dark, while the room came slowly awake around them. Grace moved down the line with a steadiness that surprised him. She'd never been in this room before, but she moved through it like someone who had rehearsed it in her mind until the rehearsal became more solid than the room. Kneeling by each face, her voice just breath, saying enough to orient them. You're safe. We're going up. Stay close. Stay quiet. A word of acknowledgement for each one, nothing wasted. Cole had seen men in uniform do worse under lower pressure. The fourth pallet from the end. Dark hair. Grace's jaw in the shape of her face, though younger. The way she came awake when Grace knelt beside her. The recognition, instant, before either of them moved, and then Grace's arms around her and the younger woman's face in her sister's shoulder. Not a sound from either of them. Cole kept working the locks. 6 women free. Moving toward the stairs, they were halfway up when the vestry door at the top opened. It was Horton, in a dressing gown with a lamp in his hand, come down at 4 a.m. for a reason he himself probably couldn't have named. Some instinct, some bad dream, some small arithmetic in his sleeping mind that had added up wrong and woken him. He opened the vestry door and saw the lantern light through the gap in the false panel and went very still. Then he opened his mouth. Cole was up the stairs in 3 steps and through the panel in 1 more, and had his hand over Horton's mouth before the sound got all the way out. What came out was muffled, not nothing, but not the full alarm either. Cole put the preacher against the vestry wall and held him there and let him understand the situation from the grip alone. Horton went still. The lamp swayed in his hand. Cole took it and set it on the vestry floor where it couldn't fall. He tied Horton to the pew with the rope from his coat. Not rough about it, but thorough. He took the lamp. He went back to the stairs and helped the last two women up. Celestine had the cart in the alley when they came out the vestry door. The women loaded in under blankets, quiet as they could manage. The cart moved south toward the boarding house before the alley was fully clear, but Horton's muffled shout had been enough. Deputy Harker came around the church's south corner at a dead run with a pistol in his hand, and he stopped when he saw Cole standing alone in the alley outside the vestry door, and his expression went from urgency to something more deliberate. Cole's hands were at his sides. Cole's hands stayed at his sides. "The women are gone. The ledger's in my coat, and it's going north with a rider in the next hour. Whatever Crowne's been building here, it's done." Harker's gun came up. Cole moved left, away from the vestry door, and behind the corner of the building, and the shot that came was high and hit adobe. And Cole's return, shot in the dark, came from a lower angle than Harker expected, and took the pistol from his grip. Harker stumbled back against the church wall and looked at his empty hand with an expression that was partly pain and partly a different kind of stunned. He didn't go for the knife at his belt. He sat down on the ground instead, and Cole left him there. Voss, the younger deputy, came around the north end of the church 2 minutes later. Cole came around to meet him, and the deputy stopped 6 feet away with his hand on his gun. Cole's hand was not on his gun. He gave Voss the plain accounting of it, the ledger, the women, the rider to Santa Fe, the federal warrant that was on its way. Crowne's operation was documented from top to bottom, every name, every payment, every destination. A judge in Las Cruces, a cattle baron in the east, 4 county officials. It was done. Voss stood in the gray before dawn with his hand on a gun he hadn't drawn. He was young enough that whatever he'd told himself about this job, some version of the truth had still gotten through. Cole watched the arithmetic moving across his face. Then Voss took 2 slow steps back and sat on the church's foundation stones and put his face in his hands. Cole let him sit. He went around to find Grace. She was in the alley with her sister and the 4 other women, all of them on foot now, Celestine's cart having gone ahead. Nora Hollis was upright and walking on her own, which told Cole she hadn't been harmed beyond what confinement does to a person. Grace had her arm around her sister's shoulders and was talking to her low, the way you talk to someone coming back from somewhere very far, reassuring them of where the ground is. Cole looked at the sky, which was beginning to lighten in the east in the long, slow way of desert dawns. They went to the boarding house. Celestine had the doors barred by the time Crowne came looking. Crowne came in full mourning, dressed and armed, with 4 of his contract men and the compact authority of someone who still believes he controls a situation that has already been taken from him. He walked south on the main street in the clear August light, and people came out of their houses and businesses to watch him go, the way people watch a man walking towards something he doesn't know has already happened. Cole was standing in the open street in front of the boarding house. Crowne slowed when he saw him. He took in the empty jailhouse to the south, the side door of the church standing open. Harker sitting on the church steps with his hand wrapped in cloth, and the particular look of a man who has been very certain about something and is no longer. Crowne's 4 men stopped behind him. The main street of Caldwell Creek was lined with people. Every person who had looked somewhere else when Grace was chained down this same street the day before. The barber, the woman from the dry goods store, the old men from the saloon bench. All of them out in the morning now, watching. "The ledger's gone," Cole said loud enough to carry. "The women in your cellar are free. A territorial marshal's rider is on the road from Santa Fe with a warrant. Every name in that ledger, every buyer, every official, every payment is going to be read aloud in a federal courtroom." He looked past Crowne at the gathered town. Every soul in Caldwell Creek who knew what was happening under that church has a decision to make this morning about which side of it they want to be standing on when the marshal arrives. Crowne's 4 men looked at each other. The oldest one, a gray-bearded man who'd done this long enough to know when a situation was past its turning point, lifted his hand clear of his gun belt and took a step back. Then another. A second man followed him. Crowne's jaw was tight. He was still doing the arithmetic. Then he went for his gun. He was fast. The stories about Thaddeus Crowne, and there were stories, the kind that circulate through county seats and border towns among men who trade in who is dangerous and who is not. Those stories all agreed he was fast, and they were right. His gun cleared leather in well under a second, which is faster than most men in that territory could manage. Cole's Colt was already up. The shot he fired went past Crowne's ear and took a piece of the dry goods store's signboard behind him, and Crowne froze in the middle of his draw with his gun halfway up, and the sound of that shot ringing out across the whole main street of Caldwell Creek. Nobody on that street moved. Even the horses went still. Cole walked toward Crowne slowly, and Crowne stood very still, and when Cole was close enough he reached out and took the gun from Crowne's grip and put it in his coat. "The women of this territory," Cole said to him, quiet enough that only Crowne could hear, "are not cargo. They are not inventory. They are not a commodity to be documented in a ledger and transferred for money. And the man who makes himself the law of a place so he can treat them that way, that man is not the law. He is its enemy." Crowne said nothing. Augusto and 2 other men Cole hadn't met, men who'd been watching from doorways and had made their private decision when the shot rang out and nothing terrible happened to the man who fired it, produced rope from somewhere and came forward, and the binding and jailing of Marshal Thaddeus Crowne was accomplished without further incident before 8 in the morning. They locked him in his own cell with his own key and left the key on his own desk. The territorial marshal, a man named Beaumont, rode in the next day with 8 riders. Cole had stayed. The horse still needed rest, and there were questions that only he could answer. He sat at Celestine's kitchen table across from Beaumont while the marshal read through the ledger page by careful page, stopping to write in his notebook. And when Beaumont was done, he looked up with the expression of a man who has seen a great many things in a long career and has learned not to be surprised by them, but is, anyway, surprised by this. Beaumont closed the ledger. He looked at Cole for a long moment. Beaumont closed the ledger and looked across the table. "You threw your badge in the Santa Fe River." "I did. Doesn't seem like it went far." Cole looked at his hands on the table. He thought about Ruth Cassidy. He thought about a courtroom in Albuquerque in the spring of 1879, and the sound of a verdict going the wrong way. He thought about the thing he'd worked out in the line shack, sitting up in the dark while Grace slept, how a legal thing and a right thing weren't always the same, and how the learning of that difference had cost him a badge and 4 years of moving through the territory without a destination. He thought about last night, and the ankle chains coming off, one by one, in the dark of a church cellar. The face of the first woman when she understood what the pick in his hand was for. The sound of 6 women moving up a staircase with no chains on their feet. "The badge was a tool," Cole said finally. "I thought I was the tool. Turns out it was the other way around." Beaumont studied him a while longer. Then he opened his notebook again and went back to work. 2 hours later, when they'd gone through every page and Beaumont had filled 12 pages of notes, he closed his notebook and looked at Cole one more time. "There's going to be a clean marshal's position in Caldwell Creek when this is over," Beaumont said. "You'd have the whole county behind you." Cole looked out the kitchen window at the main street, quiet in the morning, the same street. He thought about what it had looked like the day before with Grace and chains on it, and what it looked like now. "Appoint somebody young," he said. "They'll do it better." Beaumont didn't push. He was a man who knew when a thing was decided. The trials that followed Crowne's arrest ran through the winter and into the following spring. 17 men were indicted across 3 counties, from the town preacher who kept the books, to the county officials who'd looked the other way for money, to the buyers who'd taken delivery and paid the ledger prices. A judge in Las Cruces resigned before his warrant arrived and was found in Texas 3 months later anyway, which is how things tend to go when a federal warrant has your name on it. The cattle baron 3 counties east sold his land fast and disappeared, but disappearing from a federal warrant is a project and not a destination, and Cole heard later that he'd been found in California. 2 of the women from the Cellar testified at the trials. The others did not, and nobody pressed them. What the ledger said was evidence enough for most of the charges. What those women had lived through was their own, to keep or tell as they chose. Nora Hollis went home with her sister on the 3rd morning after the arrests, when the territorial marshal had signed their travel papers and there was nothing more they needed to stay for. She walked out of Celestine's boarding house into the morning sun and stood on the porch steps for a long moment. Just stood there, just breathed. Grace was beside her, not speaking, letting her sister have the air and the light and the ordinary fact of standing outside without chains. Cole's horse was saddled at the hitching rail. He was checking the cinch when Grace came down the boarding house steps and crossed to him. She was in her traveling clothes with her bag in hand, which meant she'd already said her goodbyes to Celestine. She stood beside him while he finished with the cinch. Grace crossed to him from the boarding house steps and stood beside him while he finished checking the cinch. She was in her traveling clothes with her bag in hand, which meant she'd already said her goodbyes to Celestine. "Beaumont wants you to stay," she said. "Run the office until they appoint someone permanent." Cole straightened and looked at the mountains north of town. The morning was clear and the peaks had a faint blue to them that only showed on cloudless days. He'd seen that blue in a lot of places, Colorado, Arizona, the high country up near Taos. It was one of the things that stayed the same when everything else changed. "He'll send someone good. He knows the territory." "He knows the territory," Grace said. "He'd rather send you." "I know." She was quiet a moment. Not searching for words, she'd had them ready and was deciding whether they were hers to give. He waited with the easy patience of a man who'd spent 4 years learning to sit with silence. "You've been moving a long time." A pause. "Moving doesn't have to be what you are." Cole looked at her. She held his gaze the way she'd held it in the jail cell when he'd opened the door, measuring, honest, not performing, not asking for anything, just offering a thing she'd noticed. "I'm not ready to stop yet," he said. "Maybe when I find the place that asks for what I actually have to give." He almost said more and then didn't. Some things are true without needing to be expanded. She put her hand out and he took it, and they held on for a moment. And then she let go and walked back to where Nora was waiting at the road's edge with their horses. Cole swung up into the saddle. He sat a moment, looking at Caldwell Creek's main street in the morning light. The same street he'd watched a woman dragged down in chains less than 48 hours ago. The same street that had been full of people who'd looked somewhere else. This morning those people were out again, going about their business, and there was something in the way they moved that was different from yesterday. Lighter, like a thing that had been pressing on them had been lifted, and they were still getting used to the absence of the weight. He turned the horse north and rode. Caldwell Creek, in the years after that August, but a proper lawman in the Marshal's office before the end of the year. A man named Reyes who'd come from Albuquerque with a clean record and no debts to any of the old operations. The Calvary Church had a new preacher by December. Celestine's boarding house became, in the way that certain places become things over time without anyone deciding to make them so, an informal way station for women traveling alone on the territorial road, women who needed a safe night, a trustworthy meal, a door that would lock against whatever they were moving away from. Celestine never charged them a cent. She would keep it running for another 14 years, and she never once mentioned the events of that August to anyone who didn't already know. The cellar under the church was cleaned out, and the iron rings were pulled from the walls. And after some discussion, the hole was filled in with adobe, and the space was eventually given over to root storage for the church's winter food. The preacher at the time, a quiet man from Ohio who'd taken the appointment not quite knowing what he was walking into, said a prayer over the filled-in floor on the Sunday it was completed. A few people in the church that day had been there on the afternoon. Grace Hollis was chained and walked down their street. They sat with that fact in their own way. None of them talked about it out loud. As for Cole Devereaux, some men who travel leave a trail behind them that's easy to follow, and some don't. Cole was the second kind. There were stories, a ranch in Colorado the following spring where he'd worked 2 months and then left. A stretch of the Arizona Trail where he'd stopped an attempted robbery on the mail coach. A small land purchase somewhere on the California coast, though the name on the deed was not a name anyone from the territory would have recognized. None of it can be confirmed, and maybe it doesn't need to be. What can be confirmed is that whatever he was moving toward it lighter than he'd been moving before, and that the thing he'd thrown in the Santa Fe River 4 years ago, the badge, the legal weight of a title, the official permission to act, had turned out not to be the part that mattered. The part that mattered he'd been carrying all along. I'm an old man now. I have sat by enough fires in enough parts of this country to know that the things that happened in places like Caldwell Creek were not unusual in their time, and are not as far behind us as we sometimes like to think. I have known the Crownes of this world, and the Hortons, and the deputies who went along because the going along paid. I have known the people who stood in the street and looked somewhere else. I have been, at times, one of those people myself, and that knowing has cost me some sleep. But here's the thing I keep coming back to, partner. Sitting by this fire with the night coming down, the darkness that takes hold in a place doesn't usually start with one bad man. It starts in the silence. It plants itself in the gap between what people know and what they're willing to say. It lives on the looking away, on the barber's eye going to the pavement, on the woman in the doorway suddenly needing to straighten the display, on the old men on the saloon bench finding something very interesting to examine in the middle distance. The bad man needs that. He cannot exist without it. He is, in a real way, made of it. And sometimes, not as often as the stories might lead you to believe, but sometimes, a man with a dust-colored coat and a battered hat and a name he stopped using a few years ago steps out of a shadow and into the street. Not because he's fearless, not because he's righteous, not because he has a badge or a title or official permission from anyone, but because he saw something that a person cannot unsee, and walking away from it turned out to be heavier than whatever came next. That's the only heroism I've ever believed in, partner. The kind that starts with eyes that won't look somewhere else. Your past may explain you, but it does not have to be you. A man who threw his badge in the river can still know what the badge was pointing at. And a woman in chains, walking down a street, in front of people who won't look, she's not walking toward nothing. She's walking toward whatever is standing in the shadow of the livery stable and about to step out. Thank you for spending this evening by the fire with me. If this story moved something in you, leave a comment below. Tell me where you were when you heard it, what time it was, what it made you think about. Subscribe for new tales of the frontier. They come out regular, and each one is a different kind of true. Until our trails cross again, partner, keep your powder dry and your soul honest. Subscribe for new tales of the frontier. They come out regular, and each one is a different kind of true. Till our trails cross again, partner.